Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Molly, for presenting Meet Our Native Pollinators. I'm looking forward to this very much myself. Molly, just a word or two about Molly. She is an integrated pest management program specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension service in Bexar County, where she provides educational outreach programs to youth and adults on entomology-related topics. Her area of expertise is urban entomology, including landscape insects, which we have plenty. She is a beekeeper, and although her schooling was primarily working with ants, the social aspect of bees is her current obsession. So Molly, thank you for being with us, and I'm turning this program over to you.
Thank you, Sally. Hi, everybody. So I'm kind of excited about this topic because, as Sally mentioned, I'm really into bees right now. I'm a beekeeper. I have been for the past 7 or so years, and so I like managed bees, but I've also gotten into, in the process of taking care of my bees, putting out plants that my bees would come to, and then just noticing all the different guys that happen to show up with those plants. And even if you don't purposely do things, if you just open your eyes, you'll realize that if you have some flower out there, you probably have some native pollinator that has come to it. So I guess the first question to ask really is, what is a native pollinator? And a lot of people think that some things are native pollinators when I guess technically they're not really, but it's something that's indigenous to the area that moves pollen from the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant. And we know that there's some plants that do that through self-pollination, wind pollination. They don't necessarily need an insect to do it. But by and large, most plants do need insects or some other animal to move that pollen from one spot to the other. So about 90% of flowering plants rely on some animal. And there's over 200,000 species of animal pollinators, but only 1,000 of those are something other than an insect. So we can appreciate bats and hummingbirds and other animals that might be doing some pollinating, but we really have to give most of the credit to the insects. And if you look and see what they contribute in pollination, it's pretty outstanding, I think. They add approximately that should be $1 billion annually to crop yield, not just $15, and to the quality of the crops. And if you're a gardener, you know that there's a lot of veggies that you might plant that require an insect to move that pollen. You might not get tomatoes that will fruit for you, or all the cucurbits require some insect to come out there. And if you're spraying a lot of pesticides and you're killing off all your pollinators, then you don't have any, you probably don't have those plants actually coming up. So there's a lot of different types of insects that can be pollinators. I'm not really going to cover butterflies in this talk because I think that's a totally separate talk about butterfly gardening, but I do appreciate them and recognize that those guys are pollinators. Instead, we're going to be talking a little bit more and looking at some of the guys that maybe you don't notice as much, and then also a lot of the bees that are out there. There's just so many different species of them. Hopefully give you an appreciation for all the different species that we have out there. So one thing about pollinators I think that to me is interesting, that I appreciate, is that you kind of have to ask yourself, what do I need to plant that makes them come to this plant? Well, some of those insects are on purpose after pollen. They pick up the pollen, and that's really a source of protein for them. And those are mainly bees. But most of the insects are actually after the nectar, and the nectars are going to be their carb or their sugar for their diet. And even for honeybees and things that we know are fantastic pollinators, they don't pollinate on purpose. It's an accident. They are very selfish about their pollen, and they want to take it back to their colony to eat themselves. So to me, it's an amazing example in coevolution and adaptations, how they're not doing it on purpose, but they're so great at what they do. Nature has figured out a way to make them kind of do it together without hurting one or the other. In fact, benefiting both of them. So I have 2 poll questions in here. The first one is to think about, how many of you guys consider honeybees to be native pollinators?
Yeah, I've launched that poll now, folks. You should see that on your screen. Go ahead and vote. And we'll just take about maybe 20 seconds and give you an opportunity to weigh in.
I'm going to keep going, though, because we'll talk about that actually in just a little while.
Okay.
So there are a lot of different native bees that we have in North America. We have about 4,000 species plus or minus. A number of those guys you wouldn't even look at and think they were necessarily bees, like sweat bees. A lot of those guys look a little bit more metallic and they might resemble a fly. Some of them are big, like a bumblebee. Some of them are teeny tiny, like a little bitty wasp or a little fly or something like that. But they should be appreciated even though they're not known as well, because a lot of these guys are better at pollinating our native plants because they have lived with these native plants for a lot longer. But also some of the plants that we really like. In Texas, everybody grows tomatoes. In San Antonio, where I'm from, especially everyone grows tomatoes because we can't really grow anything else all that well. But everyone likes tomatoes here, so we would love our native bees for that. But cherries and pumpkins and blueberries, a lot of these plants that a lot of us enjoy, we wouldn't have if you didn't have native bees doing it kind of behind the scenes and without us even realizing it. I know this is a terrible picture because you can't actually read what the names are of these bees, but I just kind of wanted to use it as almost an infographic to show you just the different ways that these bees can look. That one on the top right-hand side doesn't even look like a bee to me. It looks like a wasp. The main difference between bees and wasps, by the way, is that bees are fuzzy. They have little hairs all over their bodies, which make them better pollinators because it acts like static electricity and grabs that pollen. So it kind of sprinkles off like fairy dust when they visit that next flower and kind of land and jar themselves when they plop down. So I'll start out first talking about bumblebees. There's 46 different species in North America. They do produce honey. They're a little ground nesting bee, but they don't produce enough honey that it's worth our effort to take from them. And we would end up killing them probably if we did, because there's just not enough honey to steal from them. Our Texas Parks and Wildlife, I realize not everyone is from Texas, but our Texas Parks and Wildlife Department has a little key, and they can actually be site ID'd if you see a female. I always take a picture or see a male and I can never figure out what it is, but if you have a female, you can actually figure out what species you happen to have if you can get your hands on a pretty good site key. So they nest in the ground, like I mentioned. In some places, at least in Texas, I've seen where they have their little honey pots or their little homes, and although they have little colonies, they also like to live in neighborhoods almost and have friends nearby. So multiple different colonies will be in kind of sandy soil in a park or something, and you'll see these huge bumblebees flying in and out. The bumblebees are not quite like a honeybee or fire ants or termites where their colony continues year after year and they always have workers. Instead, they'll actually die off when it comes to the winter time, and there'll be one queen that's left inside of that hive or in the ground. And in the springtime, she'll wake up and she will go out looking for a new home, and you'll see her kind of hovering over the ground trying to dig into the hole or find a hollow spot. And until she'll lay eggs because she's mated before winter hit. And until she produces enough workers to take care of her, she will start feeding those little babies. So right now, you're seeing them, they're still producing brood and making babies if they're around your plants. But as we get a little bit further into the fall, what they're actually doing is getting enough food for that queen so that she can live through the winter so she can start all over again in the spring. So it's a brand new colony every year. It's not necessarily the same colony over and over again. Now, you may have heard in the media that we're losing our bumblebees, and we are certainly losing a number of native bees, and it's due to a number of different things. Certainly pesticide use is probably a portion of it, but I think more than that, it's habitat loss and loss of food sources. So we know that since the 90s, their populations have kind of steadily started to decline, and in certain states, that's a little bit more prevalent and concerning than it is maybe in other states. But the Xerces Society, which is this little conservation society for a number of different invertebrates, actually has a citizen scientist program that you can partake in if you choose to, where you snap a picture of your bumblebee and you can submit it to that bumblebeewatch.org. It's actually a number of different agencies that are involved in it, but Xerces Society really does a good job of pushing it. And they'll map where they are throughout the United States, and this does a number of different things. It tells people where certain species are. It tells us if certain species are declining. It tells us if the range is increasing or decreasing. So that's kind of a fun thing to do, maybe with like a school garden or among your master gardener or master naturalist group even, just to kind of watch your bees. You know, we see that they do that with monarchs, but they're also doing it with bumblebees as well. Now, I know that you've probably also heard that we have extinct bees or bees on the endangered species list. There are, I want to say it's like 7 different species in Hawaii that are local and native to Hawaii, but there has recently been the first bumblebee in the United States that was listed on the endangered species list. And I don't know what status it's at, because there's different there's a hierarchy of how threatened they are. But these guys are native to the District of Columbia area, and it's called the rusty patch bumblebee. And that was just a very recent thing as of this spring that they were added to that list by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. So they're really good pollinators, and I think that they're definitely worth conserving. And there's a couple of things that you can do, and we'll talk about this a little bit more also on how you can conserve but also encourage your pollinators. And one way to conserve the pollinator is to just help it live a little bit better. So plant things that flower. They're going to be found wherever there's a flowering plant. And if you can plant more things that provide nectar sources for them, then you're going to see a lot more of them. When you plant things, you want to make sure you don't plant it in an area where the wind is blowing so hard that those poor little things can't fly. When you hear about bumblebees being kind of a freak of nature, that their wings are so tiny and their bodies are so heavy, they physically should not be able to fly, but they are able to fly. So make it easier for them if you know that flight's a little bit hard for them. Try to plant your pollinator garden in a way that you do have a windbreak so that the wind isn't rushing through, because you'll never see pollinators if that ends up being the case. Try to plant things that flower all times of year, not just only in the spring or the summer. If you can kind of stagger the flowering season for them, then they'll stick around a little bit longer and be a lot healthier. And plant a variety of different things. Just like if we ate apples, it's a great part of our diet, but it should not be the only part of our diet. Same thing for these bees. Plant different things for them, because they need a well-balanced diet. Different things have different minerals and things that they need, vitamins for their diet also. These guys they can nest in old stumps. So if you have an old stump that you don't mind having in your yard, leave it around and you might get a little tiny little nest in there, which might be kind of fun to watch them come and go out of. Another bee that I think is probably my favorite bee. If you have them, you probably hate them, but if you don't mind them, I think they're pretty cool. Leaf-cutting bees are kind of similar in look and appearance, at least to me, to honeybees. They are interesting because they are able to almost take a perfect semicircle, 3/4 circle hole punch out of a leaf. And at least in the Texas area, they really like to do these on rose bushes. So if you have a lot of rose plants, you might notice this. But they take these little cuttings, these perfect little near circles, and they'll line the inside of their nest like insulation, and just line their nest and lay their eggs inside there. And they really like cylindrical holes, so you can make yourself a little nest for them. But people will find them in patio furniture where where it's a piping that's a hollow piping, or they've found them in hoses that they don't use very often, and they've started to nest inside of those. They're all of them will go after nectar and pollen, but there's some species, of course, that are better at pollinating than others are. And there's actually some species that are so good at that. A species that was introduced is not actually native, but it's a really important pollinator in alfalfa crops, because they just really like that alfalfa and do a really fantastic job of it. So if you see kind of a white colored honeybee, it might be a little leaf cutting bee. And if you walk outside and it looks like someone took a big hole punch and punched a bunch of holes in your plant, you probably have leaf cutting bees around. They'll never punch enough holes that it really causes major damage on your plant, but it annoys people, so they are a nuisance sometimes. But if you know who does it, sometimes you can let it slide a little bit. Another really cool bee that you hear a lot about building a hive for are mason bees. So these guys are solitary, but they like company, meaning that they like to have other little friends around them. And so you might have a bunch nesting in one similar place if it's a great place for them to nest. They're very different from other bees that will put their pollen on their little thighs. They get little thunder thighs when they pick up the pollen. If you see a bee at a plant that has pollen on its belly, its little belly is all yellow, you've got mason bees around. And that's the best way to identify those guys from other bees when they're out pollinating and picking up the pollen. But they also like to nest in these holes and cylinders, and so they'll use clay or mud, make their own clay or mud, and they'll seal up the home, but also line it, like you can see in that picture where she's sticking her head out, as insulation. And she lays her eggs within that cylinder. And she's smart. She'll lay the oldest in the front and then step over it and lay the next oldest, so on and so forth, so that the first one that hatched isn't waiting for its brothers and sisters to get its way out. It can move out of the way first. And so, of course, if one egg develops all the way and doesn't end up hatching out, pupating and becoming the adult, then they probably will all end up getting stuck inside there. But she does it on purpose so the earliest can get out. So these guys will come out in early spring like most bees will, and they'll gather food and do different things like that, and they'll start to lay their eggs in those little balls. So if you want to have a mason bee nest, maybe you live in a neighborhood and you really can't manage honeybees, but you want to do something with bees, mason bees are a great option. And the best time to put out those boxes or those little hives for the homes is early spring, or whatever early spring happens to be for you in your part of the world. In Texas, early spring is like end of February. In other parts of the world, it might be a little bit later than that. So the blue orchard mason bee is one that is used a lot of places for agricultural purposes, especially in China for a lot of fruiting trees. They actually use them like they do honeybees. And that picture is kind of an example of different types of homes that you can make for them. You want varying different diameters of the hole that you make, but you want them to be anywhere from 4 to 8 inches. Mason bees prefer about 6 inches. Other bees like a little bit shorter, so just, a variety. So it's like an apartment for bees, and all the different bees can come and live in there and choose the floor plan that they prefer. And here's some other pictures of other ones. They usually like to have like an eave on their house so that when it rains, it doesn't get inside of the holes. But you can take a 4x4 block and just drill little holes inside of it. One activity that we do in schools is we take big, like peanut cans or huge soup cans, something like that, and we wrap pens and pencils or markers with newspaper, tape it off, and slide it off so we have a perfect cylinder, but we use the marker or the pencil as the structure to make the hole. And then we just shove those inside of those cans like you kind of see in that middle picture. And you can put that out at a school garden or your garden outside, and it's not permanent. You can get rid of it if you decide it doesn't look nice. And it's a good way to recycle, reuse, and whatever the other R is for that. Another big bee that gets really confused for for bumblebees is a carpenter bee. Their wings are a little bit longer. I don't know that you would notice that if you didn't know what you were necessarily looking for, but the way that you differentiate honeybees from carpenter bees, and this is a technical term, is you look at its abdomen, and carpenter bees always have a shiny hiney. And I'm not kidding, that's how we learned it in school. Carpenter bees have a shiny hiney, bumblebees have a fuzzy butt. So if it has a shiny abdomen, you've got carpenter bees. Some people don't like them. If you've got cedar posts that are like a structural beam or decoration or something like that around the house, they will drill into those cedar posts. They tend to like cedar more than anything. And so they could be a structural pest, but in very, very rare occasions does that happen. I think the coolest thing about these guys is the way that they do pollinate. They do it through sonication. So they do buzz pollination, they call it, where they shake really fast, they vibrate, and it dislodges the pollen from the flowers, and that's how they get it on their body. And of course, they're eating that pollen, they're taking it back and feeding it to their young, or feeding on it themselves. But as an accident, they will start to pollinate other things. So that poll question was, how many people consider honeybees to be a native pollinator? In truth, they're not technically a native pollinator because there's no honeybees that are actually native to North America. They're native to other continents like Africa and Europe and Russia and places like that, but they're not actually native to North America. So most of y'all knew that. But they were introduced in 55% said no and 45% said yes. But they were introduced in the 1600s. So at what point can we start calling these guys native, right? Like at some point, they've been here long enough. They've acclimated, they've adapted. I think it could probably go either way, but technically they were never here until European settlers came over and brought them over, although they've done a very good job about it. So I'm not really going to cover honeybees just for that simple fact, and also that could be a whole other talk about them. The only thing I'm going to say about them is that of all the bees, of all the pollinators, they're the best at it. And an additional benefit is that they are one of the few insects that allows us to put them in a box and mess with them. without them getting too upset about it. We have to wear suits and things like that, of course, but they tolerate us messing with them the way that they do. And these guys are so efficient because their body is really fuzzy, like you can see in that picture. They drop pollen from spot to spot. The colony is so incredibly large. The biomass of a good colony going into winter is like 30 pounds of bees. So they have to pick up a lot of pollen. Their job is to get food for their babies. That's all they really care about most of the time. Protein is the pollen is the protein to get those babies to grow, and also to get that mother to the queen to lay eggs. And then they pick up the nectar as their carb, and they store that through the winter and other times, which we take as honey. So they're great because there's a lot of them, they need a lot of food, and they have really fuzzy little bodies. And there's other things that they do, but we just don't really have time to go over all that stuff. So if you want to encourage your native bees, remember that we do have some range reduction or habitat reduction of these guys. So if you can allow your native plants, which a lot of people consider weeds, to grow and thrive, if you have an area in the yard, you live on a lot of acreage, let that happen, because you will get a lot of native bees that come to it, in addition to a number of other different things. But consider a pollinator garden, and we'll talk about different plants to grow in just a little while. Try to avoid pesticides when those native bees are active. So you may not be able to completely avoid that. You've got a vegetable garden, and you've got tomato hornworms eating up your tomatoes, or cabbage loopers chewing up your broccoli. Just try to avoid applying pesticides when they're active. So the best time to do that really would be at sundown, when it's dawn or sundown. But I would, if I had to give you one time to do it when the sun is going down. You apply that pesticide. Those bees have gone back to their home to go to bed for the night, and they're not going to come back out until the morning. If you start looking, especially in the summertime when the sun comes up really early, those bees are out there as soon as that dawn cracks. So chances are you're going to hit them if you try to go out there at dawn and apply a pesticide. Give them some water, give them some mud. Bees like dirty water, so give them some muddy water if you can. Of course, you get into the issue of cooling water and mosquitoes, but you kind of have to decide which do you really, what is your favorite, and what do you want no mosquitoes, or do you want your bees around? Plant some native plants to your area, because that's probably what they're going to prefer. And then give them one of those little houses if you want. So moving on to other types of insects that pollinate. Wasps can be really, really good pollinators. Most of you that are north of, I would say, Austin or Waco, Texas, probably may not ever encounter these little guys, but they are moving north throughout Texas, and it's probably just a matter of time before other people will start to see them. The picture of the nest is terrible, because that's the best picture I could take. These little wasps are called Mexican honey wasps, and down in the valley in Texas and in Mexico and Central America, they're native pollinators to a lot of fruit plants. They're also a really good predatory insect against the citrus psyllid, which has devastated a lot of citrus plots. So they're kind of like twofold great bug to have around. They build these massive paper nests up in the trees, and I will get calls in the wintertime when the trees have dropped leaves, or in the springtime when the evergreen trees, the non-deciduous trees, push leaves out to make room for the new ones. And so a little naked tree, you look up and you see this huge nest, and you think, when did it get there? Well, it's probably there for a while, or maybe it just started, who knows? But these guys build this nest all incorporated in tiny little branches throughout the tree. So it's like chain link. It's really, really strong. It's not going to come down unless the tree fell down, basically. And it's a small wasp that, to me, is about the size of a housefly. When it's flying around, you wouldn't notice that it probably was a wasp. They're one of the few insects that produce massive amounts of honey. And I get this question a lot. What does it taste like? Is it edible? I heard that they only go after poisonous plants. Well, how do they know those are the only plants that are poisonous? I think it's probably edible. The only nests I've ever had have been doused with a pesticide, so I haven't tasted it yet. But I'd like to one day, and it smells sweet. It smells like it would taste pretty good. But those nests are really, really heavy when they're up in the tree, and when those guys leave, and just kind of anecdotally, they don't ever last more than a year for some reason. A squirrel or something will get up there and start to chew it up and eat it, because it's got sweet honeycomb inside there for them. But if you see that up in your tree, if you're down south, it might be a Mexican honey wasp. If you're up north a little bit more, it could be like a bald-faced hornet or something else. but I wouldn't be surprised if Oklahoma starts seeing these, or Louisiana even gets them after a period of time, because they have been kind of spreading, and they're a really cool wasp, I think. Probably one of my favorite wasps if I had to pick one. Now, not a lot of people like paper wasps, but they do pollinate, and they do predate upon caterpillars and other things. And so if those nests are in a spot you can't control, or you just hate to kill bugs, it might make you feel pretty good to know that they're doing a lot of good for you. You'll see these guys right now going after pollen, and picking up pollen, but more nectar, to feed their babies and to feed themselves. And there's the paper wasps are the ones that make the upside down umbrella shaped nest on the eaves of your houses and things like that. And while they are aggressive, when things are going after, when they're foraging, they're not really thinking about stinging you unless you do something to them first. With any of these stinging insects, when they're associated with their home is when they're the most aggressive. So if you can avoid them at their home, chances are they're not going to bother you while you're gardening and they're visiting the flowers. Y'all can live together pretty nicely. And so these are two pictures of two different types of paper wasps. Some of them are kind of a brown yellow. A lot of people incorrectly call them yellow jackets. That's the bottom right. And then the more left-hand side, I grew up calling them red wasps. It's a type of paper wasp. They're a little bit larger. There's also a number of little beetles that will pollinate. If the majority of animals on the world, so they say, on the earth are beetles, then certainly just in their numbers, they have to be pretty good pollinators. And this is a cute picture of one that's got pollen stuck all over its tiny little body. Usually beetle pollinators are going to be smaller, and they'll be deep inside those little flowers. In the summertime, at least in the Texas area, we get tons of soldier beetles that will pollinate plants. And I always get calls, what is this? I have a pollinator garden. Is it hurting my plants? No, it's doing what you want it to do. You've encouraged that pollinator to come there. They're kind of a mustard colored beetle. They don't really bite. They can fly. They don't sting or do anything to you. You can pick them up, but you'll find them in massive numbers over plants that just, after a good rain and something just pops out a ton of flowers, you'll see huge amounts of these guys. And I've noticed that they tend to like flowers that have a very strong fragrance to them, if you have any of those. There's actually a number of scarabs that will pollinate. Sometimes they'll eat the seeds inside there. Sometimes they'll chew on the leaves too, or the petals. But sometimes they're just pollinating. So there's this little hermit flower beetle that will sit inside the flowers and feed on the pollen mainly, is what they're going after, and then accidentally pollinate for you, which is good news for you. Little soft-winged flower beetles, that's probably what that picture was in that little intro slide maybe, but it was so full of pollen I couldn't really tell what it was. But they're little bitty tiny guys that will just get in there and get that, just dig in that pollen and get it all over their body, and then move to the next flower and pollinate your plants. And they come, it's kind of, soft-winged flower beetle is kind of a generic term for a number of different species. So they have a few different looks, as you can see from these different pictures. Tumbling flower beetles, these are pretty tiny little bugs. They kind of look like carpet beetles, if you're familiar with those guys, with kind of the scaly wings, but their abdomen sticks out a little bit further, which makes them a little bit different. But they're going to look like little specks, almost like seeds inside of flowers if they stop moving. If they're moving around, you'll know it's probably not a seed though. And then even some blister beetles will pollinate flowers. My rule of thumb is if there's a lot of bugs on the flower and you don't see damage to the petals and you don't see damage to the leaves, just leave them alone. They're probably pollinating for you. If you see a bunch of bugs on the leaves and you see a bunch of holes or damage to the leaves, then kill them. A gang of bugs is usually up to no good, but sometimes if it's really flowering, it's blooming its brains out, they're probably there because they're picking up the pollen and the nectar. So the guy on the left is a locust borer, which is a borer beetle that does some good for us. Pollinate. Blister beetle. Thing about them, everything has good and bad qualities to it. Blister beetles can get into hay, and if horses eat the hay and eat too many of the blister beetles, it can cause major concerns for the horses. They can cause little blisters on your skin also. Not everyone gets a blister, but some people do, and for some it's pretty painful. But they're good in the fact that they are predaceous and they also will pollinate for us. So it's all situational. And then moving on into these little flower beetles or flies, I'm sorry, that are pollinators. Syrphid flies, there's a lot of different ones, a lot of different types of syrphid flies. And so I tried to throw in the ones that you see most often. If you see a little bug that looks like it's a miniature, teeny tiny drone staring at you, they're very robotic and jerky in the way that they fly. Instead of being kind of fluid and flowy like a butterfly, they're very angular in the way that they fly, I guess you could say. It's probably a syrphid fly, but they're really good pollinators. They're called flower flies. But in addition to that, they're predaceous and they lay eggs, and their larvae are really good predators on your plant. So they're a cool fly to have around. Some of the tachinid flies is a type of fly that's also known as a deer fly, but some of the species will be really fantastic pollinators for you. And then there's bee flies. Personally, I don't see very many of these guys, but they're a cute little fuzzy fly that mimics a bee in the way that it has a lot of fuzz, but it's also a fantastic pollinator. You can kind of see it with its mouth part sticking out, trying to go after that nectar. And even blowflies, if you have a stinky, nasty flower, it will attract blowflies to it, thinking it's something dead. And you can see they've kind of laid some eggs there, and then they'll go pollinate the next flower for you. I don't know why anyone would have real stinky flowers in their garden other than just kind of the neatness factor of having it, but they'll pollinate for you. And just, you know, I said everything has some good to it. Mosquitoes will pollinate. The females will pollinate, but more than the females, the males are better pollinators because they're not picking up blood meals. They prefer nectar instead, because they don't need the blood. But it doesn't mean that you should probably be conserving the mosquitoes. I don't think that they pollinate enough to outweigh the risks or the bad things that they do. But point being is that things that you wouldn't realize are pollinators can also be pollinators. So I just wanted to cover real fast some good pollinator plant ideas. And keep in mind that I'm in South Texas where it's really hot, and some of these plants may not work very well for you, but you might be able to find some other cultivars of that type of plant that grow well, maybe for me, that might grow in your area. There's also one great source to find something that's more specific to your area is to look on the Xerces Society website. They have a list of pollinator plants, but they also have a fact sheet that is kind of that background picture that I really like, because it tells you early, mid, late blooming time, so that if you plant a few of all of these plants, you hopefully have something that blooms almost 12 months out of the year for you. And you can see the different regions. You can kind of pick your area so something is a little more targeted to where you are and grows best there. In general, if you want to attract bees, choose things that are white, yellow, or blue, that smell pretty mild and pleasant, that are pretty shallow so they have a place to land. And I won't go through all this because y'all can read it yourself, but I'll wait just a couple seconds so you can maybe snap a picture of this so that you can, if you're trying to encourage different things, you can bring it in here. Now, you'll notice if you look at the colors, it's a lot of whites and yellows and purples. Well, while insects can see all different wavelengths, what they see best are white, yellow, blue, and purple. And so if you can plan a landscape with just those four colors, a variety of those four colors, you're going to get some sort of pollinator that comes around. And if you really think about it, most weeds, when they do flower, are yellow, white, purple, right? So there's a method to that madness, certainly. So white mist flower is a kind of, I've always heard it's a pretty invasive plant. I haven't had mine become real, I haven't had it spread really bad, but this is just a cool picture. This picture was taken by a former colleague of mine in Fort Stockton. And if you know where Fort Stockton is in Texas, it's pretty much in the desert. If it can grow there, it can probably grow anywhere. But in this picture, if it comes out clearly for you guys, there's butterflies all over this. And there's probably 4 or 5 different species of butterflies just on this one plant. There's also a purple mist flower as well, and it's native, but there are probably some cultivars. If you don't really like the weedy look that native plants give in a landscape, you can probably find some varieties that are a little bit more cultivated and have the look that you probably prefer in the landscape. So that's a good one. Any of the sages or the indigo spires, or salvia is another name for it. It's purple. You're going to get a lot of butterflies. I have tons of bumblebees on mine right now, just like so much so that I'm almost afraid to go stand there because they're so loud. I feel like they're going to sting me. Here's an Esperanza picture I got with a bumblebee sticking its head inside that Esperanza. Yellow. They really like that guy. Any of the lantanas, there are some native lantanas. So bees don't really see red that well, but you'll notice that a lot of red and pink flowers will have in the center either a yellow or a white color to it to attract them to it, so they see that a little bit better. Plumbago is another one that's a really good one. There's most of them are purple or blue, but there's also some white varieties. Right now I have tons of butterflies flying around my plumbagos right now. And there's some more of that salvia or sage. I've got a little sulfur sitting on top of that one. Different type, there's lots of different varieties of the salvia. This one always amazes me. I always get butterflies on this, even though it's pink and they really shouldn't see it that well. So that whatever's in there, that nectar or pollen is forming some sort of a light that they see really well and they're going to it. Vitex is a native plant, native tree-like plant, shrubby plant here in Texas. I'm sure it goes further out. But point being, with all these plants, I know that you probably don't have them there. It's purple. It's making that little purple flower, and they're attracted to it, and they can see it. A lot of people don't like Vitex because it is kind of invasive if you don't keep the little puppies from popping up, the little babies from popping up. And here's a number of different trees or other things: wild onion, Mexican plum, red buds, cherry laurels. Of course, trees usually only bloom once, but if you have other things around, your pollinators hopefully will stick around. Any of the sages, butterfly weeds, there's a picture of the blue mist flower. Mexican mint marigolds are good down here in the south. Again, other ones, lots of other little plants that you could potentially plant for these guys. These are just some ideas. And they're, for the most part, purple, white, yellow. Rosemary. So just to talk a minute about herbs. If you have herbs and you're able to let them bolt or flower, which is a little counterintuitive for most people, because most people really like to let to cut them or pull off the flower so it will leaf out and get bushier. But if you can let these guys flower, you will collect and encourage so many native pollinators and so many beneficial insects to your landscape. It's a really good idea to try to do that if you can. You'd be amazed at what comes along. And then weeds. This is side of the field across from my house where we didn't mow it and we just had whatever these little purple flowers are. But if you are able to let native plants or weeds, I know some people don't like it, if you can let them flower, you'll bring in a lot of pollinators. Let it flower, cut it down. At least you gave them food for a little while. But if you throw out some wild seeds or you let those native grasses and weeds flower, you'll be amazed at what ends up coming to them. So I think this is our last slide, and it's our last poll question before we get into maybe some questions or discussions that y'all have. So I talked a lot about what you can do to encourage pollinators, or hopefully I did. They like a water source, right? So do you provide a water source? Do you give them a home? Are you giving them nectar? Let me move that so you can hear me. Oh, there it is. Nectar producing plants. Are you letting native plants or weeds flower? And do you actually have flowers around, if you think about it, that are blue, purple, yellow, and white? And I bet y'all are doing stuff already and don't realize that you are. And all you have to do is just kind of keep doing that. If you just go outside and open your eyes, I promise you've got native pollinators. If you're doing any of these things, they're there. You just don't realize that they're there if you haven't seen them yet.
Okay, we'll just take another 5 seconds. All righty, I'll end that and I'll share the results.
Yeah, so y'all are all doing stuff already. That's good. And most people are doing the easiest thing. You like having flowers outside. So are they blue, purple, yellow, or white? Most flowers kind of are. So you're doing it without even realizing that you are. And that's the end of this little thing. I know we wanted to save a lot of time, or most of the time, a good chunk of time, for some discussion and some questions and things, so we can get into that also. If y'all have questions about pollinators, bees, anything, and you think I'm close enough that I would be a good source for you, I added my information there, so you're welcome to shoot me an email or give me a call there at the Bexar County, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension office.
Hey, Molly, thank you. We did have, there's one question that was asked asked early on about native pollinators. Are they seasonal or are they out year round?
Well, it depends on the actual pollinator, but most of them are going to be out year round, except during the coldest parts of the month. If it's some of those solitary bees, then they're not going to be there once winter hits until spring comes around and they emerge. Butterflies, you're not going to see them really in the winter time. So coldest months where you just normally don't see any bugs, you're not going to see pollinators either.
Super. And here's another question. This one's from Georgia, and it's about dandelions. And they were told that that's one of the first flowers that come out in early winter, and that bees need the dandelions, or that dandelions provide a source of food for our native pollinators.
Definitely, because dandelions are usually kind of a yellow or a white in color. Am I right?
That's correct.
Yellow.
They're yellow color.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, if it's the first thing that comes out in your area, then when they're waking up from wintertime, that's the first thing they're going to find. And so it's super important for them. So if you have them in your yard and you can not mow, then you're really helping them out.
Okay, we have another question. It says, could you please discuss trees and pollinators?
Okay, I don't know exactly what you want me to discuss, but
they were saying that
like how
provide tree species as well.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Asking about the value as far as planting trees for pollinators.
Oh, definitely. If you are planting trees that do flower, and even some trees you don't realize are flowering and they are producing nectar. Most of the time, trees only flower once a year, but definitely there's lots of trees that native pollinators go after and that they like. So a lot of fruit trees, although those may not be native trees to your area, but a lot of fruit trees, they like those because usually they're very fragrant for them. Here in the Texas area, redbuds, mountain laurels. Now, I don't know if y'all have a lot of crepe myrtles where everyone else lives, but here we have a lot of crepe myrtles in Texas. Crepe myrtles actually don't produce nectar. They only produce pollen. So you'll only really see honeybees going after those certain times of the year. So you might want to do a little research and figure out if what you're planting, if it's a plant that is always in the ground, very big, well-established plant, make sure that it's not just a pollen-producing plant. You want to make sure you have a plant that makes nectar also. And usually it happens with trees.
Super, thank you. And then we have one that asks about the tulip poplar, and does that offer a good food source for our pollinators?
Honestly, I don't know what a tulip poplar is. I'm not a plant person. I'm more of a bug person. I don't know. My guess would be probably so.
Molly, I actually had a question about, I was in a conversation about bees and wasps. I actually had some ball-faced hornets in my yard, and I had to it was like right out front, close to where my daughter plays. So I did have to get rid of it. But basically all bees, all wasps, I mean, they're all going to serve some purpose with regard to pollination and have some.
Definitely, yeah. But no, so you bring up a good point. If you're allergic to it, if some child, usually when children are involved, that we kind of have a zero tolerance policy. It's over a bus stop or a park or something like that, or kids play in the front yard. If you're allergic, you don't want to get stung by them. They pose a medical threat. Your life is much more important than a bee's life or any other native pollinator. So just by killing one nest, one colony, even if it's honeybees, you're not going to kill them away from the whole entire world. Do what you need to do to protect yourself, and don't feel bad about it. I love bees and I love my honeybees, but if they got in the walls of my house, I'd kill them.
This isn't a question, but a comment from somebody that says, this has been great.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Peter. If you have honeybee, is it okay to have milkweed plants also? Does it cause issues with your production of honey due to some toxicities in milkweed?
No. I mean, if you think, no, it should not. I have some milkweed plants, and to be quite honest, I don't see my bees going after them. but I don't think that necessarily means anything that they don't like it or not. But if you think about feral populations of bees, bees that aren't managed, and native populations of milkweed, you can't stop the bees from going after whatever food they go after. And I've never heard of a case where they've picked up so much of some sort of nectar source where they did get whatever that toxicity was in the plant into the honey where someone got sick. So I wouldn't be concerned about that at all.
And another question, how are the pollinators faring in the floods?
Well, they're probably not doing too well. All those ground nesting things like the bumblebees and stuff, their populations are going to go down to almost nothing unless they were able to fly out and lay more eggs. It's still warm enough in those areas that they hopefully can still be laying some eggs to increase the population. The wasps and the honeybees and things that are a little bit more above ground, not so much subterranean, they're probably okay. But hopefully they had good, strong homes. Otherwise, they probably drowned.
And do you have a position on tropical milkweed?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that comes up a lot, tropical versus native milkweed. So if you're growing milkweed because you want to have a way station for monarchs or you want to help the monarchs out in some way, if your choice is native or nothing, and you choose nothing because you can't find native, then you're not helping them. There's a lot of research going on to determine if tropical is better for them versus native, and everything's just not really very conclusive. So if all you can get your hands on is the tropical stuff, just get that and help them out in some way. If you can get your hands on the native stuff, I think more people like it. But it doesn't, personally, I do not think it matters for the monarchs. There's so little milkweed out there, just they want something and they'll be happy for it.
We've got another question up, but before we get to it, Mark, is it okay if we put those next couple of poll questions up?
I actually didn't. I just put the note in there. I didn't think to do it, and we'll have to chat about a way for you guys to remind me to make sure we add those. But I did not add those final poll questions, so they will not be available. Sorry.
Okay. Are you ready to answer a question on Africanized bees?
Yeah, bring it on.
How widespread are they?
What state was that coming from?
I'm not sure. The question came from Mark.
So
I don't have a state, but if he wants to type back in his state, I can get that to you.
Okay, well, that's okay. In the state of Texas, we consider every feral bee colony to be Africanized. We don't even test for them anymore because that gene's going to come back. In Oklahoma, they're getting pretty close to getting all the way through. You can find out a map of how far they've spread, but they're pretty widespread, and they're slowly going to continue to spread. I get queens for my colonies from Georgia because I know for sure they're not going to be Africanized. If I get queens from Houston or East Texas, where they have some places where they rear queens, they're pretty hot and they're pretty mean. So they're pretty widespread in the Texas, Oklahoma, probably, I don't know if they've hit Louisiana or not yet, New Mexico. And in Texas, we just kind of have dealt with them for long enough. A lot of beekeepers here don't mind having Africanized bees because you don't have to mess with them very much. They're much more acclimated to this area. They produce honey like nobody's business. They produce babies like crazy, and they're okay in the winter. So they build up fast, and you don't have to feed them very much. You just have to deal with the fact that they're not very nice. You have to be real careful around them. So to kind of explain what it means to be Africanized, the best way that I think to explain it is all honeybees are the same species, Apis mellifera, but there are varieties of bees, kind of like breeds of dogs. All breeds of dogs can mate and produce a hybrid, kind of the same thing with honeybees. We have developed different varieties of bees for different traits that we like, making a lot of honey, being a little bit more gentle, different stuff like that. Well, Africanized bees is a type of bee, a hybrid from Africa that had got out, and it spread from Brazil up through Mexico and then into Texas and beyond. and it's mated with all of the European honeybees that might have gotten out of somebody's hive. And it's kind of like if your purebred German Shepherd got out and bred with a lab, her puppies are half lab, half German Shepherd. Doesn't matter how many more German Shepherds you introduce to those puppies to produce offspring, you'll never have a purebred German Shepherd again out of that set of offspring, right? And that's kind of what happened with Africanized bees. So you can have a lot of the gene or a little bit of the gene, and a lot of aggression or just a little bit of aggression. I don't know if that answered it or gave more information than they actually needed.
Folks, I was able to go in and add the poll real quick, so I'm going to go ahead and launch that. So please add your responses there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I see one more question, and this comes from a school garden point of view where they like to put in pollinator gardens, but yet some people are a little hesitant because they're afraid of bee stings,
right,
and things like that. So do you have any kind of, information or anything they could share to kind of ease people's minds?
So I would just say that to remind them that, and remind whoever is concerned, the parents or the principal or whoever it is, that it's when they're associated with their home that they're their most aggressive. And if they're coming to your garden to pollinate, their mind, or to pick up nectar or whatever they're doing, to forage, their mind is on getting food. It's not on protecting themselves. And there's nothing really to protect unless you reached out and grabbed one. So the chances of you getting stung by one without you touching it first in a pollinator garden is pretty slim.
And Molly, that was wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I learned something, and it was charmingly presented with some of the best color photos of those bees I have ever seen.
Thank you.
So I'm inspired. I hope everybody who is on this webinar with us leaves with a little bit different, or a little more information, a little more passion for the bees, possibly, and all pollinators. Thank everyone for being with us this afternoon, and Molly especially. You, everyone have a great weekend. I know it's Labor Day, a long weekend coming up. I hope everybody's going to have a safe and relaxing one. And tune in next month in October when Dr. Timothy Davis, I believe, is going to present new invasive ants to know about. Doesn't that sound wonderful? More invasives, yay. Okay, y'all, thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.